Robert Half International, a trusted industry heavyweight in 3 of 5 failure modes, mapping the litigation landscape of online hiring one company at a time. My name is Sarah Trumbull. I'm founder and CEO of the Job Applicant Perspective. This is going to be another long one, though not quite as long as Indeed, so I'm just going to get right into it. Since 1948, Robert Half International has been at this for 77 years. They built a global brand and a $5 billion revenue engine by sitting between candidates and clients. But here's the thing about the staffing industry. Being the oldest doesn't mean you don't have reflecting to do, too. As we shift our lens to recruiting, these same structural ghosts haunts the machine. The question we've asked of every platform in this series applies here. Did you build a marketplace or did you build an oil rig? The faces change. We move to staffing and recruiting now, but the failure remains the same. From the oldest firm to the newest apps, the talent acquisition industry has failed to grasp the basic mechanics of a two-sided market. Honest to God, I feel like they just need to go to the flower shop. What do you guys do? How do you guys treat people? What should I do now? How do I change this? Genuinely, one-winged airplanes, all of them. They aren't supporting value creation in the economy. They're industrializing economic collapse every time. Who this is for? The job seeker, especially the temporary workforce who has sensed for years that the relationship was asymmetric. This is the blueprint for what that relationship was actually designed to do and why your time was never on the balance sheet. Yeah. The small business and employer, you are the ones funding the placement fees. You deserve to see the processing plan on the other side of your transaction. If the candidate experience is extracted, the talent you receive is already arriving depleted. Municipalities and policymakers, you are the silent underwriters of this model. When labor markets produce friction, delay, and uncompensated work, your social safety nets absorb the downstream carry. This is the data on what that silence is costing your economy. The practitioners, for the legal and policy minds working on labor market structure, the case records cited here aren't just history. They are the roadmap to future accountability. Yeah. SEC, I'm pretty sure, has some really interesting rules around SK and DNO around their human capital management too, which I think is worth stating just for fun. But realistically here, caveats first. The same 2 caveats from every installment apply here. First, I am not a lawyer. I am a structural systems theorist working from first principles of economics and publicly available data. The goal is not to make legal claims. It is to make the system visible. This is a global economy. These people operate globally. I could not claim to have those skills to speak to their global impact and the legal codes over there. But I can map the system and let people look at it from their perspective and see what they think and how it applies to them. Second, this is an evolving body of work. The analysis sharpens with time and evidence. That is not a weakness of the method. It is the method. I really like Bayesian statistics. Never perfect, always learning, because I think in the internet age, that's where the ticket is. That's adaptive system stuff. In adaptive system design, precision increases with repetition. That's the kind of platforms I build, where precision, more data gets precision, you're more accurate. That's the problem with the current job boards too. More data is more chaos. In all parts of what I do, more data is more accuracy, because being wrong, error is not a diagnosis. It's information, you just learn. I provide falsifiable assertions specifically so the map can be tested, updated, and improved as the evidence evolves. Science, it's good stuff. I don't know what to say. Yeah. What a real two-sided market would require. A functioning two-sided labor market requires 2 sides. Brilliant, right? Both sides have to have signal, feedback, and the tools to participate. Employers need to communicate clearly what they're looking for. Job seekers need to understand who they are applying to and what the process might be like, whether they have time to spend on this, and whether the outcome is worth it to them. Truth. Both sides need recourse when something goes wrong. This is the measuring stick. It does not change from installment to installment. Either the vendor is there to make a transaction legible so that's to both sides so they can make informed choices, or they aren't. We have already walked through that dynamic with 3 ATS companies, Taleo, Workday, and SuccessFactors, and 2 major job boards, ZipRecruiter and Indeed. All 5, to a T, genuinely did not know how to facilitate legible transactions in a two-sided market. It's wild to me. What are we talking about? Experts, please. Now we are evaluating a staffing and recruiting company to see if they understand what it means. As ever, the dynamic switches, but the frame still honors the reality of a two-sided market system. The thing that doesn't change is a two-sided market system. The economics is very straightforward of a two-sided market system. And my 5 failure modes. Those stay the same. We just apply the same things to every company. So, what Robert Half marketed? The 1993 10K describes Robert Half plainly. I use the SEC Edgar database. I'm getting much better at it. And 1993 was as early as I could get, or there might be some one early, but it seemed like a pretty good place to start. Describe Robert Half plainly, a staffing organization. Candidates are, quote, parallel market participants, end quote. Not clients, but okay. The accounting policy is equally unadorned. Revenue is recognized only when a candidate accepts an offer. Cool. While the language around candidates shifted, the accounting policy appears identical in 1995, 2002, 2017, and 2025. Cool. To be fair, I was like a little round of applause for Robert Half, the very first company that creates real transactional alignment. Bravo. The company doesn't get paid unless the job gets filled. Wow. There is no incentive to delay or obstruct the outcome structurally. They are pulled towards completing it. I feel like the bar is just in the dirt for these companies, that they should be applauded for doing basic economics. That is worth acknowledging. But incentivizing a result is not the same as incentivizing an efficient process. A revenue trigger tied to candidate acceptance tells us the company wants placement to close. It's good. It tells us nothing about how candidates were handled on the way to that moment. The process upstream of acceptance, how candidates are sourced, filtered, presented, and cycled through the interviews, operate outside alignment the trigger creates. Any intermediary in a two-sided market can benefit from throughput without optimizing for either party's experience. But the asymmetry matters. For a candidate who needs to pay rent or buy groceries, a slow, opaque, or extractive process carries real costs: time, money, and opportunity. If that friction isn't equally costly to the vendor isn't bringing value to the economy, they're extracting it. The agent captures value at closing regardless of how many candidates were processed to get there or under what conditions. Unless the process itself carries protections or accountability, friction points accumulate, not necessarily by design, but by the absence of structural incentives to prevent them. That's the question the revenue recognition policy alone cannot answer. Because the accounting only recognizes the moment of acceptance, everything preceding it is a financial vacuum. The vetting, the filtering, and the endless interview loops are free inputs for the firm. This creates a massive incentive for process sprawl and zero incentive for efficiency. The 2025 filing reveals the cost of this indifference: a certified class action involving candidates in uncompensated interviews dating back to 2010. Robert Half, by their own revenue structure, is entirely incentivized to reach the right outcome. But they are also entirely incentivized to waste a candidate's life to get there. I'm not saying they did. I'm saying it clearly deserves more investigation. Well, you'll see what I did with the investigation regardless. The architecture of a closed ecosystem. Robert Half is not an ATS or a job board, which we have previously investigated. To understand its failure modes, you must first understand its walls. And I say this for everybody. Some people will have known this already. Others aren't. I have a diverse group of readers. In the ATS and job board model, the failure is loud and diffuse. Candidates spray applications across an aggregator. Employers receive noise at scale, and the market absorbs the signal degradation in real time. The exhaust of the filter is visible. The harm lands somewhere. Yes. Robert Half operates a closed ecosystem. Candidates don't apply to the open market. They enter a recruiter-mediated database. What happens inside stays inside. When a candidate is processed but not placed, they don't generate noise for the rest of the market. They disappear back into the database or disengage from the process entirely. The exhaust doesn't flood the market, it chokes the participant. Because the system is closed, there is no market signal for failure. A candidate who needs to pay rent cannot simply opt out of a broken process. They generate another interaction, another uncompensated interview, another preparation cycle, none of which produces a signal the market can learn from. This is the same application inflation documented in the job board installments of this series, expressed through a different mechanism and hidden behind a corporate curtain. The 3 failure modes. The following 3 failure modes represent the systemic stripping of consumer agency. First, the bait. What you were told you were entering. Second, the breakdown. What happened when the process failed? Third, the silence. The structural inability to make your experience legible enough for other market participants to make more informed choices. All 3, taken together, replicate the information asymmetry as the surface profit model we have seen in previous installments. True story. It's not confusing. It's just confusing why they're confused. What causes this, The age of the company demonstrates that while this profit model was given steroids and scale with the internet, it has existed amongst older talent vendors in a lighter format since at least when we document. I speak to when I could speak to because I've done the research from 93 on up, but I can't speak to before that. But obviously, it didn't happen out of nowhere. So one wonders when it started, and maybe it was the whole time, who knows? Failure mode 1, white labeling, the bait. A marketplace intermediary is not obligated to guarantee outcomes. No, of course not. A restaurant cannot guarantee you'll enjoy every meal, but it is obligated to tell you what's on the menu, whether the food is real or processed, whether it meets dietary requirements you've stated, and what it costs. The transaction has to be legible before you can meaningfully consent to it. Yes. A job-seeking stakeholder, according to the basic rules of two-sided markets, should, understand the process, the costs, and their recourse. Robert Half's record fails this standard, not through simple neglect, but through a specific structural imbalance. Asymmetric optimization. First, the disparity in legibility can be seen in 1993, 95, 2002, and 2025 10K. Took an assortment of them just to see what I could look at, What the employer receives. Contractual service standards, a documented expectation of quality, fee transparency, a clear price and payment structure, verified search status, certainty that the search is active and funded, optimized AI, tools explicitly designed to deliver them the best talent, financial recourse, a formal guarantee period if the placement fails. Cool. What the candidate receives. Standardized silence, no documented service obligations or standards. Ambiguous intent, no documentable way to know if the role is real job or database building exercise. Asymmetric AI, only visible in the 2025 10K, no documented insight to how algorithms are used to sort or process them. Swear to God, I really think these algorithms are just MacGuffins, economic MacGuffins. Way more interesting is this lack of instrumentation on supposedly two-sided markets. It's an interesting choice not to instrument 98% of your market. I feel like the algorithms, again, MacGuffins. Zero recourse, no documented protections or feedback loops if the process fails them. Structural indifference versus active extraction. This isn't necessarily an argument that Robert Half designed a system to exploit people. Rather, the absence of incentives to help candidates produce a similar result, produces a similar result as active exploitation. Yes. In an asymmetric market, structural indifference is extractive regardless of intent. A car with broken wheels causes the same accident whether the owner forgot to fix them, couldn't be bothered to fix them, or profited from the neglect. For the person in the road, the impact is identical. Documentation of this absence is the true statement. If there's never an argument to clean up your room, you won't clean up your room. If you're renting houses that have like broken roofs and nobody makes you fix them, you won't fix them. It's not active intent. It's lack of accountability. Failure mode 2, the breakdown. In high volume systems, failure is inevitable. Roles close abruptly, keywords mismatch, and placements collapse. That's just how it is. The hallmark of a true marketplace is whether it builds error handling infrastructure to catch these failures. Robert Half's 2025 filings and the Pellegrino versus Robert Half record reveal a stark asymmetry in where that infrastructure is built. The resource allocation gap. What Robert Half offers 2% of the job market stakeholders. Remind yourself, according to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, the job market stakeholders who are HRs are like 1 million people. You know, like I'm being generous here. They're actually more like 1%, but globally it's maybe 2%. And it just, anyway, 2% of the market stakeholders. I'm being generous. According to the BLS, for employers, when a placement fails, documented recourse mechanisms exist. For permanent placements, the 2025 10K documents a 90-day guarantee period. RHI carries the financial liability for candidates who do not remain with clients through that window, with amounts recorded on the balance sheet based on historical data. For temporary placements, the client services agreement documents a 1-day replacement guarantee. If a client is dissatisfied from the assigned individual within the first 8 hours, RHI will not charge for those hours and will provide a replacement. Employers also receive dedicated account management infrastructure to manage ongoing service delivery. What Robert Half offers 98% of the job market stakeholders, according to the BLS, job seekers. Half their stakeholders, half their stakeholders, so half the market is job seekers and half the market is employers, right? In a way, in terms of the structure of the market, they're two-sided. But 98% of the market's users easily are job seekers, and I think I'm being generous there. It's more like 99%, depending, But regardless, like what they offer 98 to 99%. For candidates, when a placement fails, no documented recourse mechanism exists. The public record contains no guaranteed period protecting candidate time or preparation costs. No placement or remediation process is described for candidates who complete interview cycles without placement. No account management equivalent exists. No escalation pathway is documented. It is worth noting that failure to meet employer needs carries a direct cost to Robert Half, a lost client, lost revenue. Failure to meet job seeker needs carries no equivalent cost. The closed ecosystem means a candidate who has a bad experience generates no market signal, takes their uncompensated preparation time with them, and is replaced by the next candidate in the database. The vendor loses nothing. The employer loses nothing. The candidate absorbs the full cost of the failed experience alone. When the cost of a failed stakeholder experience falls entirely on one party and not at all on the vendor, that is the structural definition of extraction. The infrastructure asymmetry documented above is not incidental to that condition. It is what makes it sustainable. The investor claims versus the architecture. In the Q1 2026 earnings call, Robert Half's CEO told investors that the company's AI matching engine, quote, does that same matching for the benefit of our candidates and is, quote, proprietary data on candidate performance, end quote. The claim is presented as competitive distinction from job boards that optimize for clicks rather than outcomes. The most recent 10K contains no candidate satisfaction metric, no feedback mechanism, and no design channel with which candidate could evaluate whether that matching engine served them. Whether the infrastructure exists that doesn't appear in the public record is something only Robert Half can answer. What the public record shows is the claim without the documentation to support it. That gap matters because the claim is being made to investors, not to candidates. Candidates have no surface on which to confirm or dispute it. The people the matching engine purportedly benefits are the only participants in the transaction with no documented means of evaluating whether the benefit is real. In every other sector where a company claims to optimize for consumer outcomes, the consumer can measure the results. Here, the measurement infrastructure exists for one side of the market only, and that is the side making the claim. Yikes. Software versus human architecture. While platforms like Taleo or Workday bake candidate neglect into their software, Robert Half bakes it into its operations. The asymmetry isn't a glitch. It is expressed through training. Recruiters are evaluated on employer metrics, not candidate satisfaction. Headcount. Resources are funneled into employer-facing rotations and account protection. Documentation. 32 years of filings lack any mention of candidate onboarding or support equivalents. The inventory philosophy. Love that word. The Pellegrino opinion documents the internal terminology that justifies the lack of support. RHI's own account executives use the word inventory to describe the candidates they recruited, the pool of individuals to be placed with employers. Inventory is a thing to be managed, not a stakeholder to be served. Across the documented failure modes of a nearly 80-year-old company controlling billions, the record is consistent with an organization that never once had to ask what a two-sided market impacting human survival required of it. The architecture made the question unnecessary. The verdict? At Robert Half's scale, spanning decades and hundreds of offices, this lack of candidate-facing infrastructure is not an oversight. When your operational language defines people as inventory, a lack of support isn't a gap in the design, it is the design. Failure mode 3. Unprojected market consumer to unpaid revenue generator. Yeah. Return to the premise established at the opening of the analysis, okay? Robert Half is incentivized towards outcomes. Cool. Revenue recognizes when a candidate accepts an offer. Cool. The company doesn't get paid unless the placement closes. Also cool. That alignment is real, and it was worth acknowledging when we named it. It is worth naming here again, honestly, because the bar is really in the dirt on these companies. So at least we got one that sort of knows what a two-sided market is. Let's step forward. Because what follows, though, to be fair, is not an argument about outcome incentives. Robert Half had those. What Robert Half did not have was any incentive to optimize the process that produced those outcomes. And in a captive market, an unoptimized process is not a neutral condition. It extracts. The candidate absorbs the cost of every inefficiency the platform had no structural reason to fix, not because anyone designed the harm, but because no one designed anything or a way to talk about the nothing being provided or available. That is the distinction this failure mode documents, incentivized towards the result, indifferent to the road. The pattern holds. As in previous installments of this series, the structural argument runs as follows. If candidates were stakeholders in a two-sided market Robert Half was serving, the user experience would exist. You do not audit a logistics contract by asking only the shipping company whether the packages arrived. If talent was the product Robert Half was selling, the user experience would also exist. Any vendor serious about delivering a product instruments that precise experience of the line, touch points, and friction. The absence of candidate-side infrastructure doesn't just indict Robert Half, it indicts every employer who accepts deafening silence from the candidate side as a normal operating condition. Legit, though. Employers running sophisticated vendor evaluation processes, backed by investors who fund those evaluations, accepted the silence without demanding to see the other side of the pipe. I don't know what to say about this. Consider the strangeness of this. Legit. Think. Move it out of stuff because we all have this. Think of it as another light here. Parents purchase tickets to a theme park that promises to manage the entire experience for their children. To take the children through the parks, the parents don't have to. And then it structurally erases the children's ability to speak about their time there. In no functioning economic market does that produce a theme park worth attending. Not once ever. That's why it doesn't exist, because it doesn't work. And when the theme park isn't broken rides, but delayed access to food, clothing, shelter, and healthcare, the stakes of that silence are not abstract. It's just fascinating. It's more like, I didn't know isn't a sign of innocence. It's an admission of guilt, really. Like, you were supposed to know. The fact that you didn't know is pretty indicative. I'll speak of that next one. But this is not an argument, realistically, that the transaction is illegitimate. No one's saying that. It's an argument that the transaction has been structured so its costs land entirely on the one party who is not at the table, cannot leave the market without losing their income, and has systematically been stripped of every tool that would allow the market to self-correct. Robert Half built a pipeline that governed humans' ability to pay their rent. Employers knowingly purchased it. Between them, they constructed a market with no accountable party and one unprotected one. Structural extraction does not require intent to harm. It requires only that two parties find it equally unnecessary to care, and that the absence of user experience be the mechanism that makes that indifference permanent. The structural truth. So what does Robert Half actually even sell? If they aren't delivering talent, employers can source their own candidates, and they didn't do UX, so it's not talent they're after. And they aren't meeting the non-paying customers' needs on the employer's behalf. Job seekers aren't stakeholders, and they aren't talent that's being sold. Then what does the fee purchase? We would formally submit an employer purchases the offloading of responsibility at Robert Half. Robert Half sells the power of being the unilateral governor of a two-sided market without the perception of the stress of having to act like the person in charge. They sell ease. The employer does not have to manage the friction of sourcing, filtering, and cycling through the unplaced human majority and their data. Somebody else does that. Somebody else manages those human beings through that process. The product is the employer never having to ask what the process looks like. Ease is the product for the employers. The candidate's time, the screening calls, the preparation cycles, the interview attendance, the availability holding is what gets processed into the thing the employer is actually purchasing, which creates a structural problem. If ease is the product and candidates produce the ease, then candidates are essential to revenue generation. But they are not the product being sold. And in Robert Half's documented architecture, they are not the stakeholder being served. As we have noticed, to be a product or a stakeholder, UX is required instrumentation of a vendor. A party that is required for revenue generation is not the product and is not the stakeholder, occupies exactly one structural category: an unpaid revenue generator, an unpaid human revenue generator, captive, they can't opt out, not by accusation, by arithmetic. Yeah, stochastic, right? Not by accusation, by arithmetic. The candidate's presence in their system, their preparation time, their interview attendance, and availability are inputs Robert Half converts into the ease it sells. The conversion happens without compensation, without protection, without recourse, and without any design mechanism to hold the platform accountable when the process fails them. The absence of job seeker user experience is not a gap in the product. It is what makes the margin possible. You save money on what you don't build. The candidate absorbs what Robert Half and the employer clients mutually agreed did not need to be provided. The documented expression, Gentry. Gentry versus Robert Half International is not an employment law story. It's a documented record of what this structural condition produces when it runs for 14 years inside a closed system. Jessica Gentry sued RHI for failing to compensate temporary employees for time spent preparing for and attending client interviews. The court certified a class of all California-based temporary employees who attended at least one uncompensated interview with Robert Half client since March 13, 2010. In a market with genuine exit options, this practice does not persist for 14 years. People argue with me, it's captive audience. It doesn't persist if that's the case. Candidates route around it. The practice self-corrects. Here, it did not, because the exit options were not real. Temporary workers dependent upon placement in need of income facing a market where Robert Half's scale made the firm difficult to avoid were not positioned to leave. The captive market made the extraction sustainable. The lack of user experience reviews made it sustainable too. The helpful threats of don't talk about your hiring process or else that doctors and lawyers and everybody else would be sued to high heaven for. But and in the hiring market, it's professional. And it sounds like something that Corleone family would say, right? The uncompensated labor Gentry documents in the process cost Robert Half had no incentive to eliminate, and employers had no incentive to question. Screening calls, client preparation, interview attendance, post-interview availability, holding 3.5 to 5 hours per cycle per candidate in a closed ecosystem governed entirely by the two parties exchanging money, neither of whom bore any costs. This is what unilateral governance of a two-sided market produces. Not a design scheme, a structural inevitability maintained by the absence of any mechanism that would have made the cost visible to the people absorbing it. It was really important that nobody know, right? That nobody could make an informed choice so they could consent. Yeah. The strategic containment, litigation as architecture. When structural harm in Robert Half's business model finally became visible in the form of a class action lawsuit, the company's response was not to redesign the candidate experience. It was to fortify the walls. How to tell me? Come on, it's so obvious. For 11 years, Robert Half deployed a deliberate legal architecture designed to disaggregate, isolate, and contain the very stakeholders it claims to serve. The defense of a closed system, rather than treating the lawsuit as a feedback loop that they'd never had before to improve stakeholder relations, the company used its structural leverage to prevent individual claims from combining. The broad agreement, candidates signed standard employment agreements as a condition of working with Robert Half. Those agreements contain language designed to prevent collective legal action. When candidates tried to sue as a class over uncompensated interviews, Robert Half pointed to those pre-existing agreements and said the candidates had already agreed to fight alone. The court said the provision was unenforceable. The second attempt, after losing that argument, Robert Half tried again. Following a 2022 Supreme Court decision, they went back to court, claiming their own contract meant something different than they'd previously argued. The California Court of Appeal rejected this too, calling it a, quote, tortured and unreasonable reading of Robert Half's own words. The logic of the litigation mirrored the logic of the platform. The same closed ecosystem that prevented candidates from warning each other on the website was deployed to prevent them from warning the court. The cost of extraction. The ultimate proof of this architecture is who it left behind. While the class survived to trial, it did not survive intact. The regional class covered a 14-year period of accumulated claims beginning March 13, 2010. The trial class covers only the period beginning May 31st, 2024. The candidates whose claims accrued during those years Robert Half fought the hardest are the ones the legal system can no longer reach. Bottom line, this is not the behavior of a company protecting a valuable stakeholder relationship. It is the behavior of an enterprise managing a liability within its own inventory. By spending 11 years ensuring the total bill of accumulated accountability could never be assembled, Robert Half proved the containment of the candidate was always more valuable than the candidate themselves. The dual extraction, labor and data as raw material. The uncompensated labor extracted from job seekers is only the first layer of the structural condition. A 2018 Baird, I'm not sure if I'm saying this right, is a BAIRD investor presentation documents a second quieter currency being mined from the exact same population. Seeking Alpha has so much interesting investor information. When viewed together, these two tracks reveal a business model built entirely on the uncompensated extraction of human labor and data. Track 1, the currency of physical labor. As documented in Gentry, candidates are required to invest significant uncompensated physical labor into the platform before a transaction ever occurs. The input, preparation time, unpaid interview, attendance, and holding availability. The conversion, Robert Half packaged this front-loaded human effort and converts it into the frictionless ease it sells to employers. Track 2, the currency of digital labor data. In June 2018, squarely inside the Gentry class period, Robert Half explicitly pitched its proprietary data insight to investors as a primary competitive advantage. Yikes. The candidate-generated data points specifically labeled as, quote, temp candidate assignment performance, end quote, and, quote, perm candidate placeability. The conversion, Robert Half captures these performance records and converts them into corporate equity value sold to Wall Street. The architecture, the parallel between these two tracks is structural, not incidental. The candidate sits at the center of a data extraction mechanism operating entirely in the dark. The person whose real-world performance generates the data has no documented access to it, no visibility into how it dictates their future, and no mechanism to correct it if it is wrong. They do not even know it exists as a line item on an investor slide. The documentation doesn't show anywhere that they were telling the job seekers that. Like I said, white labeling. How to tell me that you're like not safe as people. The bottom line, the two distinct currencies, labor and data, neither is disclosed to the candidate and neither is compensated. This is the exact playbook of an enterprise managing a natural resource. You extract the raw material for free, process it in closed facility, and sell the refined product to the highest bidder on the outside. Like, floor fell out of the labor market. Are wages down? Prices up? Gosh, I can't remember why. Can't imagine why. Like, seriously, it's like people don't know what an economy even is. I don't know how to process this. Like, what causes this? Anyway, I do. I have an idea. I'm going to talk about it, but it's just, what? The bottom line, so it's sold to the outside. We do not put a dollar figure on that data here, on the data that was extracted from them that they pitched to investors. I don't have access to what that dollar sign is. I don't put it in. The architecture that the extraction happened, that it was hidden, that the candidate was never told is the argument. The valuation is left for forensic accountants, the plaintiffs, and the regulators who come next. The capstone. They knew how to build it. The 2025 10K describes robust internal survey infrastructure for Robert Half's own employees. Engagement surveys, new hire surveys, departure surveys, third-party benchmarking. The company measures its own employees' experience with documented care and rigor. None of this infrastructure exists for candidates within the public record. No design channel through which candidate who attended the interviews and was not placed could evaluate their experience or warn the next person. This is the detail that removes every remaining defense. Like, putting a star rating, you cannot argue to me that a star rating is hard to do. When every eBay, Amazon, Etsy, every small platform does it. You can't argue that it's hard to do. You can just argue that you didn't do it. This is the detail that removes every remaining defense. Not, we didn't know. Robert Half built feedback loops when they served the business. Not, the market would have corrected it. The market cannot correct what it cannot see. And the closed ecosystem was specifically designed to produce no signal the market could read. Not employers would have demanded it. Employers were purchasing ease. Demanding visibility into the candidate experience would have complicated the transaction they were paying to avoid. The absence on the candidate side was a decision made by a platform that knew how to build the infrastructure, maintained by employers who benefited from not asking for it, and defended for 11 years by litigation architecture designed to ensure the people absorbing the cost could never aggregate into accountability. In a functioning two-sided market, the feedback loop is not optional. It is how the market learns, adjusts, and protects the integrity of both sides. Its absence here was not an oversight. It was the condition that made the margin possible. You cannot go to any academic field and argue that a market without a feedback loop, that a system without a feedback loop functions. It just doesn't. It extracts, but it doesn't function. People arguing that they don't need feedback loops. Yeah, why don't you go to your car and cut your gas? Yeah, see what happens. Cut the line so they can't see. You can't see when you need to buy gas, right? Tell me about that. It's just this. It's the same. It's a system, a physical version of the system, but the social system is the same. If you cut feedback loops, you don't make it go away. You just make it so you don't learn about it until it collapses, It was the condition made in our process. The candidate was required for the revenue, not the product, not the stakeholder, governed by a market they had no vote in, no recourse within, and no ability to warn others about. I swear to God, economic infrastructure is governance these days. Yeah. So, sorry. Okay, distract here. Incentive towards outcomes was real. The indifference to process was structural. The governance was unilateral, and the candidate absorbed every cost the transaction was designed to externalize onto them. Job seekers, the national ghost hour tax, scoped from the public record. Figures below speak to magnitude, not precision. They are derived from Robert Half's own public archives, and external sources were indicated. Methodology. Ghost hour tax converts the uncompensated time job seekers spend in application cycle into a macro dollar figure. Evaluation metric, grounded in Chodorow-Reich, sorry, I never say this right, I'm not sure, Carbonus Opportunity Cost Framework, RHI scaling factor. Because RHI is a specialized staffing ecosystem rather than a broad job board, its actual candidate volume is anchored directly to its SEC-reported national placement numbers. So these figures represent the absolute floor, the candidates who actually secured employment through RHI nationwide. Starting line, in 2010, 176,000 national placements established the baseline at the commencement period of the 14-year tracking period. The high watermark in 2017, volume scales up by 20.1% to a peak of 211,400 placements. Current state 2025 volume plummets by 55.4% from its peak to 94,300 placements, representing a near halving of the original 2010 baseline. Shocking. Scaling to the total national candidate pool. To capture the true population paying the ghost hour tax, we apply industry standard interview to placement ratios, 10-to-1 or 20-to-1, to the placement floor. This accounts for the massive volume of candidates processed but never placed. For the record, given the givens, the credibility is in the mud. It's hard for me to, we have to start somewhere, so we have to, focus the framework somewhere and on numbers that we do have, but I would be hard-pressed to believe that it's only 10-to-1 or 20-to-1 these days. They clearly, if they're openly admitting to the SEC that they don't, operate a two-sided market and they've been in business this long, then they clearly don't feel any accountability to candidates. So why would we believe that they're honest about their numbers? There's no reason to believe that. They're clearly not being held accountable by anybody for anything. They just say whatever they want. They said whatever they want to their investors. Even the investors didn't ask them for demonstration. Monopoly numbers here. Well, we're starting somewhere because we're starting somewhere. We're taking them at their word. Let's say it's 10-to-1 and say it's 20-to-1, At the 10-to-1 floor, RHI processed 1.76 million national candidates in 2010, rising to 2.11 million in 2017. At the 20-to-1 ceiling, RHI processed 3.52 million candidates in 2010, rising to 4.22 million in 2017. Cumulative 14-year national impact, when we calculate the aggregate volume of candidate cycles moving through the entire U.S., Robert Half's ecosystem across a 14-year period, the numbers scale dramatically. National floor, approximately 23.5 million candidate cycles. National ceiling, 20-to-1, approximately 47 million candidate cycles. This is anchored by Robert Half's explicitly reported SEC placement milestones, including 2010 commencement baseline, 2017 historical peak, and the documented 2024 to 2025 revenue decline. A year-by-year economic model of RHI's U.S. staffing volume yields a conservative cumulative total of approximately 2.35 million placements over the 14-year period. So, candidate dollar calculation. To convert candidate cycles into macroeconomic dollar figure, the model applies two standardized baselines. Time burden floor, 5 uncompensated hours per candidate cycle. Baseline wage, $22 an hour, BLS median, but weighted for higher averages. So Robert Half's people tend to make more than the baseline median. We're moving it from 2010 to 2024, just, I don't know, starting with the Gentry, just place to start, place to go from. And so we went with $22 an hour because they actually tend to make more, but the salaries would have changed over a 14-year period. Again, we're talking about scale, not precision here, a framework to look at this. And I expect that forensic accountants can do a more specific number too. The opportunity cost multiplier. A 1.5 to 2 times scaling factor applied to the baseline wage per the Chodorow-Reich and Caricarbonus to capture the true economic value of lost search time. Financial matrix, by projecting these inputs across both the 10-to-1 and 2021 volume models, the total national gross hour tax splits into the following valuations. Step 1, raw time less. 10-to-1 floor, 117.5 million hours extracted. That's taking the number and then multiplying by 5 hours, taking the original number, 23.5 million times 5 hours. And then 20-to-1 ceiling, 235 million hours extracted. Step 2, direct costs at $22 an hour. 10-to-1 floor, $2.59 billion in uncompensated labor. 20-to-1 ceiling, $5.17 billion in uncompensated labor. Step 3, the true economic cost, the Chodorow-Reich, 1.5 to 2 times. The 10-to-1 floor, scales range 3.9 to 5.18 billion. 20-to-1 ceiling, scales range 7.76 billion to 10.34 billion. Yeah. So I would like to emphasize here that we genuinely don't have a reason to trust Robert Half's 10-to-1, 20-to-1 numbers, just especially if they're given how unaccountable they clearly are, even to their investors, to be able to say random things that are clearly undemonstrable, to have openly said for 32 years that they operate a two-sided market, well, to the SEC in penalty of perjury filings, while documenting that they don't instrument 98% of the market and being so unafraid of being called out for that. I just don't think it's reasonable to just trust their 10-to-1 numbers, but I'm trusting it because I'm taking them at their word. But I do think those numbers need to be investigated. We need to have a better understanding of what that actually is, and not from people inside the system, but from people investigating it as if it's worth investigating, because they aren't trustworthy. Their ability to look at this rationally doesn't exist. But we have to start somewhere doing it. And 5 hours, I took that from the Gentry case. Again, scales, magnitude, not everything, but something. Reasonable central and national estimate baseline verdict. Even when anchoring the data to conservative 10-to-1 processing floor, the macroeconomic drain over 14 years of uncompensated job seeker time within Robert Half's ecosystem sits securely between 3 and 5 billion across a 14-year period. Small business benchmarking blindness. The operational distinction. First, unlike applicant tracking systems and open job boards, Robert Half's impact on small businesses does not stem from a high-volume noise engine. While prior installments of this series detailed the mechanisms of a local labor drain and access cost inversion related to market noise, in this particular case, we found those systemic burdens are more appropriately evaluated with the municipal framework of the analysis. Instead, for local pizza shops and hair salons and daycare centers, the bread and butter of the mainstream U.S., we assessed the operational friction of Robert Half International is different. It is an information failure, not a volume failure. 2, the mechanics of benchmarking blindness. Small businesses, from coffee shops to independent accounting practices and local healthcare clinics, operate entirely outside of the staffing industry's closed loop. The lack of transparency forces them to manage talent acquisition based solely on two highly distorted outputs. Number one, uncompensated cycles, opaque processing, and no signal. Output one, the burned out candidate. Output two, the perception gaps. Let me say it this way. The candidates flow, so small business blind, so output two, perception gaps. It's weird to say on mine. I have some graphs I'm looking at here. Distorted hiring expectations of corporate hiring. And illusory of ease for other people. Exhausted interview stamina from the job seekers and workforce costs hidden and it's externalized. Small business blind spot conclusion, the workforce is broken and unreliable. They look at other people and think the other people are experiencing ease. They look at the candidates they're getting and they think they're not reliable. Output 8, the candidate flow mechanism. Candidates arrive at small businesses after cycling through uncompensated preparation loops, opaque interviewing layers, and zero feedback rejections within the agency ecosystem. Result, candidates are already burned out, defensive, and carrying distorted expectations about the hiring process. Because the closed ecosystem emits no data signal, the small business owner inherits a cynical candidate without understanding the systemic cause of their disposition. Output B, the corporate perception gap. The mechanism, small business owner observed enterprise-level competitors moving through talent acquisition with apparent ease, comparing it unfavorably to their own struggles. Result, what is inevitable to the small business is that this corporate ease is artificial. It is purchased. What is invisible to the small business corporate ease is artificial. It's purchased by externally polluting the workforce's capacity and ability to engage. The structural narrative trap. In the absence of macroeconomic data or structure visibility, small business owners are forced to diagnose their hiring friction using only the immediate symptoms available to them. This creates a false market narrative. Systemic misdiagnosis. Observe systems, high candidate drop-off, low engagement, and fragile interview cycles. Resulting narrative? They move to what they know. The local workforce is unreliable. Candidates are difficult. Modern hiring is inherently broken. People are lazy. Kids these days. These sorts of things. By masking the structural extraction of candidate time, the closed ecosystem ensures that the true root cause remains completely invisible to the local employer. It doesn't just disrupt the experience within that ecosystem, it creates friction between the remaining candidates' employers so that they distrust each other even more. And there's already ATS and other things going on. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. The economic fallout, the invisibility is structural, not incidental. The downstream liabilities of this model do not land on enterprise firms. Instead, they're offloaded onto entities least equipped to absorb them. Failed hires, misjudging candidate exhaustion or defensive posturing as poor performance or bad fit. Depleted community trust. Small businesses damage their local employer brand by reacting to broken candidate pool with increasingly rigid defensive hiring measures. Retention deficits. Local employers lose their ability to effectively access and retain talent because they are benchmarking their operations against invisible, subsidized corporate machines. In no other existing marketplace are we having entire departments spending hundreds of billions every year to subsidize the market, having profits everywhere, and having candidates result like this. It's clearly businesses are putting signs up in windows even. Everybody knows this. It doesn't work, but it is profitable. There's a difference between optimizing profit and optimizing a market's utility, and nobody seems to know what it is anymore that's in charge of anything. Everybody on the outside does, but we can't shut it off. Like, that's why unilateral governance is the worst, you know? The public infrastructure transfers mechanism. Unlike the open algorithmic platforms or high-volume job boards analyzed previously, the friction generated within Robert Half's ecosystem does not stem from the digital application spam. Instead, it is a structural byproduct of a closed system that extracts uncompensated candidate time without producing external data or market signals. Because this ecosystem operates without public transparency, the economic friction it creates cannot be absorbed internally. It is systematically externalized through direct economic chain. Between 2010 and 2024, anchoring calculations to a conservative 10-to-1 interview to placement ratio, Robert Half extracted 1.6 million to 1.8 million national candidate cycles annually. For the millions of candidates who cycled through this loop without securing a placement, the uncompensated time burden directly prolonged their periods of wage instability. This private financial deficit immediately converted into a downstream carry distributed across public municipal infrastructure. Direct fiscal strain increased utilization of local food safety nets, food assistance programs, housing support, and municipal social services. I cannot underline enough. Friction in an employment market is like just straight economic harm to everybody who is not the vendor. It's municipal tax strain. It's people not being able to eat. It's kids not being able to go to college. That's what it is. Like, it's schools being underfunded. It's roads being underfunded. Friction is not neutral in this market. And friction's always going to exist. But uninstrumented friction is not neutral. It's just a choice for profit in the pain. Direct fiscal strain, administrative burden, heightened processing volume, and operational strain on local workforce development boards and state unemployment insurance programs between temporary assignments, revenue destruction, deferred, diminished, or permanently lost local tax contributions from workers trapped in prolonged OPIC search cycles. Okun's law projection. This local friction scales up to immeasurable macroeconomic damage by applying Okun's law, which defines the structural relationship between unemployment, search friction, and broader economic output. The macro-level cost of public revenue becomes clear. Every 0.1% increase in structural unemployment driven by systemic friction and market opacity represents approximately $56 billion in foregone annual GDP. Again, I'm aware that I'm using between 2010 and 2024, and it's not going to be exactly the same every time. Magnitude, not precision here. Think it through. I want to give a framework for looking at this. Reality, a closed ecosystem that hides processing data, deprives municipalities of the instruments required to see price or mitigate the drag on their local economies. The final accounting. The national ghost hour tax, estimated between $3 and $5 billion on a baseline floor over the 14-year tracking period, represents real economic value that did not simply vanish. It was reallocated through a rigid corporate to public hierarchy. The platform, RHI, captures the margin by externalizing its operational costs, processing costs, onto the candidate pool. The candidates absorb the immediate costs and uncompensated hours and delayed earnings until financial exhaustion is reached. Municipalities absorb the residual deficit, funding what the individual candidate can no longer financially hold. Policy bottom line, municipalities and local workforce boards are forced to subsidize the downstream failures of an ecosystem whose structural design choices they had no hand in shaping. Unilateral governance of this market is wildly inerrant. Like, how to tell me it's like such like giving up sovereignty. The labor market is a public utility at this point. Like, it's access to every other public utility. Like, I don't understand this thinking. Check the research. Failure modes described in this analysis are not novel observations. They reflect foundational work in market structure, platform design, and user infrastructure. George Akerlof, John Nash, Rochelle Troll, Nielsen, the ACM Code of Ethics, professional conduct. It's all basic stuff. SEC filings from Robert Half. I like using the SEC because they have the pendency of perjury and they're really easy to move through. Now, a note on the job applicant perspective. TJOB is the company producing this series, but Robert Half is the oldest name we've examined, founded in 1948. It survived every era of labor, newsprint, the early web, the aggregator boom, and the algorithmic turn. And at every inflection point, they made a choice about what to build and for whom. The public record reveals a chilling consistency. For 32 years of SEC filings, the language is identical. Candidate supply is a risk to investors. The candidate is not a stakeholder. They are an inventory. Robert Half listed the loss of candidates as a business threat while simultaneously building zero infrastructure to earn their trust. The pattern doesn't require software. It only requires a candidate who cannot leave and a platform with no reason to protect them, and a candidate who cannot signal to the market lest they be threatened with further access to employment. The job seeker experience was never absent due to a technical gap. It was absent because legibility would have killed the fees. Confusion drives volume. Volume produces extraction. It's just ease. That's all it is. Profit in the ease is profit in the pain. And the pain is not for them. It's for everybody else. Confusion drives volume. Volume produces extraction. Even Robert Half, for all his years, genuinely didn't seem to understand what a two-sided marketplace was and what it required. Swear to God, they really just need to talk to local flower vendors. They need to talk to Disney. Disney knows. For all their flaws, they're aware of how they should talk to, children and how they shouldn't. The TJAP strategy. Starting from the other side, TJAP is what happens when you start from the opposite direction. We did not build a better way to purchase talent. I just don't like that terminology. But we built a marketplace for the function of hiring. Employers post what they need. Job seekers rate what they experience. The signal flows back in the market as public information. It really isn't as scary. Watching so many trained economists argue for market failure and against market function is just wild to me. The technology isn't novel. Amazon did this for products. Uber did it for rides. Airbnb did it for rentals. The only thing missing was the will to build it for the person trying to feed their family. For 70 years, the candidate's experience was treated as incidental. It wasn't. It was load-bearing. It always was. Robert Half built an architecture that ignored that weight. TJAP is the instrument that changes what that costs. The verdict pattern holds even here. In staffing and recruiting, the architecture is older, more human, less algorithmic. The failure modes aren't lines of codes. They are habits of mind. But the fundamental condition does not require an algorithm to operate. It only requires 3 ingredients. Captive supply, candidates who cannot easily leave, measured silence, a market that refuses to quantify their experience, and the script, marketing language that carefully masks the machine underneath. ATS, I'm going to say this straight, ATS platforms market efficiency. Their product, however, is exclusivity, which is inefficiency rebranded. Employers paid for the feeling of importance, while candidates absorb the cost of a system that was never designed to find them. It was designed to exclude them in order to deliver the exclusivity that employers were asking for. Job boards sell connection. The architecture produces record levels of disconnection via information asymmetry. Employers paid for the feeling of providing reach, while the market they created textbook documented its own dysfunction in real time. Robert Half sells a human hiring experience. The architecture produces dehumanization. Employers paid for the feeling of being unburdened and caring. Candidates absorbed the cost of a process no one was required to respect. 3 business models, 3 structural inversions, each one legible from its own public archive, each one functioning to allow employers to act as unilateral governors of a two-sided market while paying specifically to avoid responsibility for what that governance produces. The true horror of this story is how utterly mundane it is. The banality of this is wild. There was no conspiracy. Extraction does not require one. It only requires that the person with the least power has no surface to speak on, no system designed to listen, no witness willing to notice. The filings were always public. The math was always there. Once you see the architecture, you lose the ability to unsee it. The pattern both explains and predicts. I swear to God, it acts like a secular religion. The series will continue as long as it takes. The set list is long, but